Hello, Lisa.
Hello. Nice to meet you, Chris.
Likewise, likewise. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I know it's been like a few days trying to prepare for this as well, so I really appreciate it. The reason I decided to have you on is because I was looking on my X profile and this profile came up of the Free Speech Union in Canada. I thought, okay, that's interesting because I know, because obviously there's Free Speech Union here in the UK, there's one in Australia, and now there's one in Canada. There's maybe going to be others elsewhere as well. So I thought it'd be interesting to have someone on from that organisation to talk about free speech in Canada. So I'm really glad that you've come onto the podcast. But before we speak about that, just a little bit about yourself in terms of your journey up until this point and why you decided to help form the Free Speech Union in Canada.
Well, it's a bit of a longer story. I'll try not to belabor it, but I suppose I've been in this what you might call a culture war for almost a decade now, and so I'm a lawyer by background. I took a little hiatus after practicing law for a number of years as just a basic trial lawyer, personal injury, that kind of thing. I took a hiatus to raise my kids, and I ended up taking a longer one than expected because I homeschooled them. So when I came back to practicing law in, I guess, 2017, our legal regulator, the Law Society of Ontario, had just announced that it was going to make all lawyers swear a statement of principles that they would promote DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in all aspects of their practice, in their lives, in their retirement, or whatever. And I thought, okay, I've been following this sort of growing culture war. I know those words sound nice, but they don't necessarily mean what they say. And we're supposed to be independent as lawyers and not have to, you know, swear allegiance to a political viewpoint in order to be lawyers. That shouldn't be required. So the nutshell version is that I started a campaign and I got a bunch of other lawyers to join with me, and we ended up getting a number of them elected to the governing body of our regulator and got rid of that requirement. So that took about 2 years of hard work to try and get that done. And after that, I started working for a civil liberties charity in Canada, doing free speech work, religious liberty, that kind of thing. I was there for a couple of years during COVID. We fought a lot of COVID battles. And then I went out on my own and ended up with a lot of clients who were of the same kind of, had the same kind of legal issues. I think once you stick your head above the parapet and people see that you're not afraid to go to bat for these issues, which are a little controversial sometimes, then you attract more and more of those kinds of clients. So, and what I found was that there were a lot of people who had reasonably good cases, or at least cases that should be taken to court, even if they wouldn't win. Our courts don't always see the world the same way I do. Um, but people don't have the money to take that risk. And I, as a sole practitioner, can't take all the risk. So sometimes charities would fund different cases. But when Toby Young, who heads up the Free Speech Union in the UK, who founded it 5 years ago, reached out in a Spectator article, I guess it was, to see if anyone was interested in starting up a free speech union in Canada, I reached out too. I thought, certainly can't hurt to have another organization dedicated to fighting these kinds of cases and helping people. Even if we don't agree with people's speech, if we don't protect the principle, it's just going to continue to be eroded. And frankly, if nobody fights it, then it's going to get steamrolled over us, and no one will ever be able to speak freely again. So that's the short version.
Okay. So in regards to free speech in Canada, because there seems to be very similar issues, especially in the Western sphere, Western countries, regardless of where you go. But we specifically speaking about Canada, what free speech issues have they been? I know that sounds a bit of like a loaded question because this must be endless. But what are the main issues regarding free speech in Canada, and how A, the government has reacted to it, and B, society, what society thinks about it?
Yeah, I think very similarly to all the other countries in the sort of Anglosphere and Australia, New Zealand, the UK has been dealing with this, United States as well. There are a number of different um, sort of there are a number of different forces kind of applying together, and it does sort of feel like it's coordinated, or at least it's the same kind of thing happening in most of our countries. It may take a different form on the ground. There's a different legal system in each place and a different kind of, environment locally. But generally speaking, there just seems to be this idea that we cannot really have free speech. We have to, that our governments are uncomfortable with people speaking freely. They're a little bit afraid of their people in many of these cases. And they would rather that they didn't have unlimited speech because, well, they might criticize government policies, or they might not go along with whatever is trying to be forced down our throats. So this is kind of taken the form of governments wanting to stamp out what they call misinformation and disinformation. Oftentimes there is stuff that's not true that's being said out there, but frankly, the governments aren't always telling the truth either. And so quite often you see that they're pushing laws that will, or agencies that will help monitor misinformation and stamp it out. But oftentimes, especially we saw this during COVID, it is the government itself that's spewing the misinformation. And so we have some ominous laws in the pipeline. Our government is on hold right now pending a leadership review for our Liberal government. So we will have an election soon, and hopefully this bill will disappear. But the Liberal government that we have currently brought in something called the Online Harms Bill, which was in theory going to help get rid of things like child pornography and that sort of thing on the internet, which nobody could find any objection to. But it went much further, of course, and they built in all sorts of other things, ways to regulate people's speech. A new agency developed to handle online complaints and that kind of thing. And then sort of also reinstating what we used to have many, many years ago, which was removed by the previous Conservative government, which is a section in the Human Rights Code of the Canadian Human Rights Code that would allow people to take other people to the Human Rights Tribunal for harmful speech. And so anyway, you can just imagine how many people would abuse that, and there's an incentive in it for them to get compensation. They don't have to have a lawyer. So that legislation is quite ominous as well. And of course, just the culture. We've got a culture now that we've had over the last decade that's increasingly censorious. People don't want diverse opinions being heard, and so they will cancel your speech at a university, or prevent you from having a platform, or mob you online, or report you to your boss, or any number of things. But that's kind of happening from the ground up too. So it's kind of coming from both directions, which I think is happening in most of our countries, top down and bottom up, and increasingly a censorious environment for saying anything that isn't in a very narrow Overton window of what's acceptable speech.
I kind of smiled, but in a sad way. I know it sounds like a bit of oxymoron when you said the online harms bill, because the UK has exactly a bill like that, exactly the same name, online. I think it was called online harms bill. Now I call it online safety bill,
Mhm.
which again is not exactly this whole thing. So, in regards to the Canadian version of that bill, what is specifically wrong with it, in your opinion?
Well, there's quite a few things. They really wanted to go very, very far. They even have something that we've been calling a pre-crime, like minority report, where if somebody reasonably believes that you might say something harmful, they can get a recognizance, or like kind of like a restraining order against you. You could even have an ankle bracelet put on you. Like it's just so over the top. And then there's different components to it. There's a regulatory part that looks at online speech and regulates platforms. And then, as I mentioned, it opens up the possibility for one person to take another person to the Human Rights Tribunal and get an award against them of, like, I think, I don't remember the amount, it was 20,000 or something, in award against somebody for saying something that, well, as Toby Young calls it in his cute phrase, hurty words, basically. It's just people who will find harm in anything. Maybe you've misgendered them, or said something that they find offensive. They can drag you off to the tribunal. So yeah, it's quite a lengthy bill, and there's a lot more to it, but those are the main concerns.
Pre-crime sounds like something from a Philip K. Dick novel. It sounds like from Minority Report.
Yeah.
Um, how in that bill, how does the government determine what a pre-crime is? Because that seems very sinister and very discriminatory as well.
Well, it certainly does. And what I'm concerned about, well, first of all, this would be something that would be happening in the courts because you would go to the court and use that legislation to justify getting this restraining order or recognizance against somebody who you felt was going to say something that would potentially cause harm. So, yeah, sorry, what was your question again?
That's all right. So the pre-crime element of that bill, it's
Mhm.
like, how on earth does the government define it in that bill? That seems a very odd thing to put in a bill.
Yeah, I don't know that it is defined. So language, what we've described now in our courts, and which does make its way into the bill, is language that is intended to create detestation or vilification of someone. So those are the terms, but they're very subjective as well. And what might be a vilification or detestation to someone is not to another. So anytime you have these kinds of words that import subjective determinations, you're just opening it up for abuse too. And I think one of the concerns that I've had over the last number of years that I've been watching these issues unfold is that they are not universally applied. So certain things are considered to be hate speech or harmful speech, and other things which someone else might find harmful get a pass, right? So there's a double standard that tends to be applied. I'm sure we've all seen it in all of our own countries. So the law gets applied unevenly and illiberally to certain groups over others.
Just remain on this online harms bill for a minute. Does that include like having to ID yourself online and things like this as well?
There were, this one does not get into all of that, but I suspect if our Liberal government were elected again, we would be bringing that in as well. I don't think that they were trying to accomplish that with this particular bill.
Okay. The reason I ask that is because when you talk about speech, you talk a lot about verbally as well, but there's other parts of it as well in terms of free speech, and and one of which is technological as well. We've just had the UK government, from what I call, like, as this interview is going ahead, I think it's to do with Apple. So Apple wanted the fact that basically Apple have allowed them to like go into the UK government to go into their systems and like search for certain things, which I think is a bit sinister. I mean, there's probably much more to it than that, and I'll probably get something in the comments explaining it in more detail. But is there a technological aspect in regards to free speech, i.e., the government wanting to find out things about emails and private messages on social media and that? Have they discussed that as well?
I don't think that's in this particular bill. I would not be at all surprised because, as we talked about earlier, so many of these things seem to be in lockstep. As one country does it, then others kind of bring in a variation on it. We have a whole bureaucracy that they wanted to set up. Remember, this is all kind of on hold right now, pending. Like our government is currently prorogued, which means it's basically everything's been stopped. We don't have a sitting government right now. But and so that as a result, all these bills have been basically they've died on the order paper. So they may or may not come back. But one of them was also dealing with a digital safety platform. So I don't think that it got into. I don't know. I don't want to. I haven't reviewed that one as closely, so I don't know exactly what all the terms are. But I don't think it went as far as what you're saying. They're suggesting with this. With Apple, it was more to monitor to require larger platforms to remove objectionable content on their platforms. So, and there was a little bit of a bureaucracy that was set up or going to be set up in order to monitor that. So that's ominous in and of itself, but it does seem to be going further in your case that you just mentioned.
See that again, all these words are just ringing in my head like, oh, get my spider sense going. But things like objectionable words and stuff, it's like, who determines that? Like, who actually is going to enforce this? Is it going to be a body, or what department of the Canadian Parliament is going to actually monitor all this?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. What will have to happen is they'll set up some sort of a bureaucracy with these do-gooders who are going to sit there and determine what's objectionable. I mean, we saw this happening in the States too, and it sort of came to light through the Twitter files, right? If you were following that story, how the U.S. government, which is not supposed to restrict anyone's speech, they have a very robust First Amendment that protects virtually all manners of speech. There are some limits, but they're not nearly the kinds of limits that most of the rest of the Anglosphere has in their free speech, either protections in their constitutions or conventions. But despite that, the government kind of went through the back door, and it had these online platforms doing the censoring. And as we learned all of that, we could see that there were all these agencies that had sprung up, especially during COVID, where literally like teams of well, activists, I suppose you could even call them, who have an agenda, probably a very sort of left-leaning agenda, where they want only certain speech to be permitted and others to be curtailed, right? So they have these misinformation bureaus that were essentially set up to monitor, and so it would be something similar. You'd have people who were sort of unaccountable, unelected people determining what speech was acceptable and what wasn't. So yeah, it's a terrible thing. We don't want to have that.
I'm just see. I shouldn't be shocked by any of this because there've been so many similar stories across the world. But yet, as you're talking to me now, I am, and I just wonder with Canada, what was free speech like in Canada, or the concept of it before this current government came into power?
Well, so we have something called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was actually came in as part of the repatriation of our Constitution from Britain, because we were a colony of Britain. In 1982, we got this Charter of Rights was built in as part of it, and it says that that Canadians have a right to freedom of expression, freedom of religion, etc. But there's a limitations clause that says, subject to such reasonable limits as may be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So those reasonable limits is where you get into some trouble. We technically have the protection of our freedom of expression. It's guaranteed to us, but there's a big but. And that those limitations tend to be more, they get a lot more attention from the courts than I would say than the protection of speech does in terms of, we're always talking about whether something is should be limited, right? We focus on that aspect of it. And so while I think our speech was a lot freer, there's been this sort of cultural trend. I can't entirely blame it on our government because it's been happening all over, but they are certainly seizing on this cultural moment to try and find other ways to restrict speech. So it certainly was freer, but I think that was also cultural as opposed to government, if you know what I mean, because those limitations have been there. But our Supreme Court in the early days of the Charter really did kind of tout the freedom of expression as such an inalienable value. They really did give it a robust treatment, but that does seem to be changing. And as the makeup of our court changes and as the culture changes, the restrictions are getting greater and greater and more justified by our courts. So let me give you an example. I had a case a few years ago when I was working with the Justice Center. I came into it at the appeal level with another lawyer who had already done the lower level fighting. So we were at the the Court of Appeal for Nova Scotia. And this was a case involving a gentleman who had a personalized license plate with his last name on it. His last name was spelled Grabher. Graber, you might pronounce it. It's an Austrian name, or Grabher is what it looks like. And that was shortly after President Trump. At that time, he was running for his first campaign, and he had used the expression "grab her," and fill in the blanks. And so somebody complained about Mr. Grabber's license plate because they thought that was an offensive term, even though it had been on his license plate for 20 years. And in fact, he worked in the prison system. He had a uniform he wore to work every day with a badge on it with his name. So it was, it was just his name. But someone complained, so the registrar of the motor vehicles department decided that it was time to go. He couldn't have it anymore, and so he sued. And the government got an expert report from some feminist scholar in Nova Scotia who opined that the women of Nova Scotia would be much safer at night, or well, at any time, if Mr. Grabber's vehicle was parked in his garage. I mean, it was kind of crazy. And we lost that case. They decided, the court decided that, he really didn't have any particular free expression rights to that license plate. And they gave credence to this expert report. So it's just one small case of many, but it just gives you a flavor of how hard it is to kind of defend basic free speech in this country.
That's great over personalized number plates. I'll be thinking, what business is it of yours to look at? If you have if you have that plate and someone sees it and you accepts them, just walk away. The car's going to drive unless it's parked, and even then you can just walk away or let the car drive off. I don't understand how that can offend anyone, to be honest.
I don't know. I mean, just people get offended far too easily. But I think that's just kind of taken as an excuse to kind of continue to curtail speech. I don't know why it is that people don't just kind of brush things off the way that maybe we used to do. I can still remember as a kid saying things like, "Well, it's a free country," or somebody said something offensive to you, you'd throw it back at them, or you would just ignore it, or that we had the old sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me kind of thing. But now everybody gets offended about everything. So it's just different.
Isn't that part of the problem with free speech, not just in Canada, but in Western countries, that instead of teaching them that, we've kind of indulged in this? Because one thing I've always thought of is you can blame this generation for saying, oh, what's happening with free speech, it's like young current Gen X, so to speak, or Gen Z, sorry. But really, I would say blame the parents above, because the parents should have said something back then. Do you think that's one of the problems, that we've actually indulged in this nonsense?
Yeah, I think it's part of it. It's just there's so many different factors that have played into it, but I think that's part of it. The helicopter parents, parents, families are smaller now. People have very small numbers of kids, and maybe tend to hover over them more and protect them more from things that they probably should just be letting them kind of, skin their knees and take a little joke once in a while. But yeah, that's so I do think that's part of it. Um, hopefully we can kind of restore that culture again. But I think once it's lost, it's kind of hard to bring it back. I think, well, anyway, we're going to keep fighting to at least keep the government and large institutions from curtailing speech. But really, it is a cultural issue. And if we don't sort of get it together and stop kind of supporting this mob culture and cancel culture and so on, people will find that it's the speech they want to express that gets canceled too. It just continues to grow and grow. So you might be able to say, well, that shouldn't be allowed, but all this should. But the problem is that once you start putting those subjective restrictions in place and start allowing certain things to be curtailed, then it only grows.
Yeah, indeed. So going back to the Free Speech Union of Canada,
Mhm.
when was it set up? How many months ago?
So we actually just launched officially on Monday. We did that in part because I was coming to the UK to participate at a conference, and Toby Young wanted to be able to announce that it was off the ground. So we worked really hard to get it off the ground, get the website ready, get everything done. But it has been in the works since the fall of 2024. We officially got the corporation set up. We got our board in place. We got some advisors in place. We made sure that we had the capacity to handle some cases. When we have our first case, which we haven't announced yet, but we have our first legal case that we're going to take on. And we have some ideas for some campaigns as well to start shifting that culture in Canada. We're gonna be, I think, will become a very prominent voice for free speech in Canada. There are other civil liberties organizations, but they are focused on a variety of different issues. Ours is singularly going to be on speech and academic freedom and so on too. Like that's kind of part of it, but we'll also be not just working against government restrictions, but in the universities, wherever else we find that we can make a difference. Yeah.
Which leads me on to academic freedom in Canada. Obviously, I heard about this through Jordan Peterson, what he's saying, and then again, is another common trend where you have universities and how they're dealing with speech as well. Is there similar issues with regards to free speech in Canadian universities, or are there some issues in there that are unique to Canada in regards to their universities and free speech?
Yeah, so one of the things with universities is that although they're almost all publicly funded. They typically, with the exception of possibly in Alberta, one of our provinces, most courts have not found that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that I mentioned earlier applies to universities. So remember that your right to free speech is vis-a-vis the government. The government is who you protect your free speech rights as against. They're the ones that like you don't necessarily have a free speech case you could bring against your neighbor who curtailed your speech, right? It has to be as against the government. So, but universities, although they don't have a charter, they often have free speech policies and academic freedom policies, which they're not respecting. And they can still cause quite a bit of harm to, whether it's to an academic, as we saw with Jordan Peterson, or to students as well, who are in this environment that has become very censorious, restrictive in terms of what you can say. I'll tell you actually, you're going to be the first to hear about our new case because it is in a university. So we have our first client is a Scotswoman, Scottish mature student who she came to Canada, I think probably 30 years ago, and she got an undergrad degree, and then she left to go and teach in other countries, teach English as a second language and so on. And then she came back and she couldn't really get proper teaching jobs because she needed to have despite all her teaching experience, she needed to have a Canadian degree. So she went back to teachers college in her 60s. And well, what a culture shock that was to go into a university setting. So she's a no nonsense woman, and she calls it like she sees it. And well, we have another aspect to that sort of DEI acronym. We have another D, and that stands for decolonization. And
Yeah, I know that.
yeah. So I guess in her Indigenous pedagogy class on the first day, she asked the instructor, who's an Indigenous woman, she said, how do you anticipate that, or how do you expect decolonization to look on a math test or in a chemistry lab? Like, practically speaking, you keep talking about decolonization. What does it actually look like? How are we doing this? And well, anyways, you're not supposed to question anybody you're just supposed to accept the concept of decolonization without asking too many questions about it. And then I guess she referred to an individual who's a teacher that was in the news, who had been a male shop teacher, but then had suddenly one year turned up with very, very large prosthetic breasts and a wig, and she had misgendered this teacher. So then they thought she was transphobic. So then there was an emergency meeting of the DEI committee who concluded that this student had to go. She was really shouldn't be allowed to continue in the program. And they put some pressure, by the sounds of it, they put some pressure on the associate dean, and they put her through a number of struggle sessions, and eventually put her on a conditional status. And she had all these criteria she had to meet to stay in the program. It was really quite onerous and horrible. So we're suing the university. She did get her degree, but it was an awful experience, and nobody should have had to go through that. You should be allowed to ask questions and question the content of the courses even. Nothing should be sort of sacred and untouchable in a university, because the culture should be a robust, exploration of ideas. And if your ideas are so bad that they can't withstand any reasonable questioning, then they ought not to be taught as the gospel truth. So anyway, that's the kind of case we're looking to do. It's not so much a government, so it doesn't relate to our Charter of Rights, but somebody's speech was curtailed with serious consequences, and hopefully she'll get some compensation for what she went through.
It reminds me, and I think this, I don't remember if it's an American or Canadian university, but it reminds me of the case of Lindsay Shepherd, if you remember
Yep.
that from a few years ago. Obviously, Lindsay Shepherd was a student at that time, but that was interesting because Lindsay Shepherd, when she had her meeting with the university faculty, that she recorded what was said in that meeting, basically taped it. And I imagine, I don't know this case, but I imagine something similar was said to this woman that you're defending as well.
Yes.
That was quite a few years ago. It just seems like nothing's changed at all. It's just,
Yeah.
they,
Yeah, Lindsay's case, I remember that. That was in 2017. That was around the time Jordan Peterson was just kind of coming onto the radar. There was some other professors who spoke up to defend Lindsay at that time. I've actually gotten to know her a little bit, and it's a small community of people who actually seem to be on the free speech side. So we get to see each other at various conferences and so on. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, and that was shocking, and she fortunately had the wherewithal to record it. And I would certainly encourage anybody else going through something like that to do the same, because sometimes it's just something you can't believe is actually happening until you hear it yourself. But you're right, I don't think much has changed, at least, from what I saw with the case I was just describing. Here it is, 8 years later, and we're still hearing the same kind of stuff. So I don't know. The university's maybe a lost cause. I don't know if they can turn sharply enough that they need to get on the right track again. From that conference that I was attending this week at ARC, I had the impression that a lot of people felt that they're probably not redeemable, and new institutions have to be built in their place.
Yeah. Universities are one place, obviously, across the Western world where free speech is curtailed. In Canada, are there any other professions where free speech is actually curtailed to an exaggerated amount?
Yeah, well, funny you should mention. So I'll tell you about a couple of other cases that I've had. They weren't through the Free Speech Union because they were part of my practice before. One was involving a nurse. Now, this was funded by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, I want to say, and they did a great job funding this case. It was very important, but it was for a nurse. In fact, people here in the UK probably have heard about it too. A nurse by the name of Amy Ham, who was a gender critical nurse. She wasn't doing anything in her nursing job. She was just on Twitter, as it was called then, posting about things. Well, and actually what brought her first to the light of her regulator, this is the body that decides if you get to be a nurse or not, right? They regulate the entire profession in her province. And so actually what happened first was that she had put up a billboard in Vancouver that said, "I heart J.K. Rowling." Because you probably know J.K. Rowling had come out in support of Maya Forstater, who was a gender critical woman in the UK who had a similar kind of cancellation, right? So you guys have been dealing with this stuff here, and you've got a bunch of great precedents for us, because we don't have the same kind of positive support for gender critical thought as has been developing here in the UK. But in Canada, so Amy had put up this billboard. A couple people complained about it. And her regulator said, okay, we want you to sign an undertaking and be suspended, and basically admit that you're a transphobe. So she declined, and they took her to a disciplinary. First, they investigated her, and they went through all of her comments on Twitter, all the articles she'd ever written, and pulled together this dossier of about 300 pages worth of tweets and things. And then they took her to a disciplinary panel. So I represented her at that, and we had a 20-day hearing over about a 1.5 year period. And I mean, it was just like we were through the looking glass. It was just the weirdest thing. The experts that they had for the other side were determined to help prove the case that because of her gender critical views, trans people would not seek health care. That was the argument that they were trying to make. So for a nurse to say, look, there's, male and female, and, it's an important health consideration. If you can dress however you please, is kind of the J.K. Rowling speech as well. But, when it comes to something like your healthcare, maybe it's important to know what your actual sex is, because that could be relevant to your healthcare. So pretending that it's not what it is could actually be very dangerous. So for a nurse to have to go along with this, just because that's the current dogma, well, it's dangerous potentially. So in any event, we've had a case, we argued that one, and we're still waiting for a decision on that. It's been almost a year since that hearing. So that was one. And then another case, I had mentioned my law society. So we see it with the legal regulators trying to push stuff down on all the lawyers. And then another case was during COVID. My client is a physician who was questioning lockdowns, questioning mandates, those kinds of things, right? And so her regulator cautioned her, or wanted to caution her, not to say these things on X, So X Corp actually helped fund that case, and she's been challenging that. We're still fighting that one as well because, first of all, I think she was right on everything, but in any event, why should the regulator decide what physicians can and can't say, especially, if there's something that should be subject to reasonable debate? And it's like all these organizations during COVID decided this is the only narrative you can express. And that probably, I think quite likely, caused harm because we didn't get to hear that there were counter opinions that might have prevented certain mistakes from being made in the response to COVID. So anyway, there's lots of places where it's happening. That's just some that I have personal experience with, but they're all over the place.
That's mad. That's, I mean, it just strikes me how similar a lot of these cases are across like the Western world because we've like the medical profession and with universities. It's just striking how similar some of them are, and the fact that I don't want to be conspiratorial, but it makes you think, are these governments actually colluding with each other? Because it just seems crazy. There's so many similarities.
It does, I know. And actually, this is another thing that I think is great about starting a free speech union in Canada is, and this is different from the other civil liberties organizations. And so I think we're going to be very complementary to the other groups rather than competitive. And that is that we have sister chapters in other countries. And you had mentioned Australia. There's also New Zealand, Switzerland, South Africa. And we actually met this week as a group with our new international FSU international head. He's just been appointed, and a corporation has been set up for that. We're going to be looking, and he's a former diplomat. We're going to be looking at ways to make submissions at a global level and monitor these kinds of initiatives as they happen at the UN and different other supranational organizations, where I think some of these ideas are getting implanted, and then kind of passed down to all the different countries. At least in some cases, that's maybe why they're so similar. They do collaborate in that sense. They do share these ideas, and maybe there's too much of an echo chamber there that they're not hearing other perspectives. So maybe we can help break through that a little bit. But I think we will get a lot more of these free speech unions developing in other countries, particularly where we really want to focus are the ones where there was free speech and it's backsliding. I mean, there's places in the world where they never really had it, and they should, but if the West is going to be an example, we have to stop backsliding. And so we want to make sure those countries get support that they need, and and that a movement builds within those countries to push back and keep us from backsliding on those liberal values and Enlightenment values that made these countries great in the first place.
We've talked a lot, and normally when this topic comes up, we talk about how it's left wing, it's the left, they're restricting free speech as well. But do you have any examples in Canada, or have heard of examples yourself, where actually actually the left themselves have said something and they've been cancelled and they've needed to be helped? Because normally when this topic comes up, it seems to be, oh, left cancelling everyone else, whereas I'm sure there must be examples of the left being cancelled themselves and actually their free speech being curtailed.
Yeah, and actually, I wouldn't mind taking one of those cases because we are nonpartisan. But the reality is that the cancel culture has come from the left. They've had that power for a number of years now, where they've been kind of shaming everyone and canceling people. That has been a left phenomenon for some time. But you can easily see how if the dynamic changed, the power shifted right to the other side, that people might use and employ those same kind of cancellation tools on their opponents. And I suppose we haven't had as many cases like that. There haven't been too many that I've seen. I think there've been a couple with the protests, pro-Palestinian protests, but they haven't had the same profile. Uh, Certainly, I would say if somebody wanted to protest in favor of the Palestinians, they should be allowed to do that as long as they're not breaking other laws that are, time and place and, traffic laws, those kinds of things that they're not assaulting people and that kind of thing. But if they're just protesting, or say a professor is saying something about the Palestinians, they ought not to be canceled for that. And I would certainly support trying to take a case that defended positions that are kind of coming from the left, typically coming from the left.
Well, you've led me on to my next point, which is protest. Uh,
Mhm.
what does the law in Canada say about protest in terms of what you can protest about and any restrictions on protest?
Well, so that's another one of those things that is protected under our Charter of Rights, the right to peaceful assembly. And there are some people can and should be allowed to go and protest. That is something that we recognize as a fundamental right. Sometimes when they're blocking infrastructure or being destructive, well, then that's not a peaceful protest, and the police might get involved at that point. But what's interesting is what I think, seen is a bit of a double standard on that as well. So we had the trucker convoy that you might have heard about during COVID, where
Yeah.
the streets were filled with people waving the Canada flag and kind of having a party in the streets and honking their horns and trying to get the mandates to stop. And well, of course, the people of Ottawa didn't much like that. And ultimately, the Emergencies Act, which is pretty draconian legislation that allows the government immense power, that was invoked to stop this particular protest from happening. And people had their bank accounts frozen, and some people went to jail. Tamara Leach, who was one of the organizers, spent 48 days in jail on a conspiracy to commit mischief charge. I mean, if you can imagine, it wasn't even that she did anything, that like it was a conspiracy to commit mischief. Mischief is actually not something you would go to jail usually for 48 days for, even if you were sentenced. So it was quite draconian. And then since October the 7th of 2023, we have had protests virtually every week in the streets for the pro-Palestinian groups, and not nearly the same kind of a reaction. So again, there's this double standard problem, which I find particularly galling. If you're going to be, well, they shouldn't have been that draconian against the truckers in the first place. In my view, that was not appropriate, and the courts have since agreed. But the yeah, but they seem to turn a blind eye to the other kinds of protests.
From a societal point of view, how has free speech affected Canada? Because I know over in this country, for instance, especially from a political side, if you support one side or the other, whereas decades ago you would find some common ground, that seems to be less and less and less now because both sides are very entrenched in what they say. Is that the same with Canada, where it doesn't even have to be left or right? It could just be, I believe in one thing. And are people losing friendships over that? Is it gone that bad?
Yeah, I think so. It hasn't kind of affected me that badly on personally, but I've certainly heard stories of families being split over it. And again, when I come from a generation, so I'm a Gen Xer, um, and when I grew up, we didn't even talk about politics really. It was not, there was a sort of unspoken rule. You didn't ask people about their religion or their politics. And you'd get people working in service clubs or in their jobs or whatever, and side by side, chatting about stuff. Maybe politics would come up, but it was never sort of personal. It was just a thing out there that you could discuss. But now it has become very personal. And I suspect it's partly that sort of Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals kind of manifesting, when you're supposed to make the political personal, and that has happened, and I think it's happened more on the left, but the reaction is from the right is kind of in tandem with that. Because it just becomes very difficult to tolerate the person when their views are so aggressively born as their identity. And I think that leads to a lot of those kinds of splinters. But yeah, I think uh, one of the problems too is that when you don't have free speech and you don't have access to hearing a variety of opinions, when you've got a media, as we do in Canada, that is almost entirely in lockstep with what the government says, so they don't let other opinions get out there through them. So people live in very different echo chambers. It's almost like they don't even know what the other side is all about. More so from the left, because the right does hear these things because it is in the mainstream media. You do hear what the left thinks. It's in your classrooms. If you're in university, you're going to hear about the left's perspectives on everything all the time. But from the left perspective, you could go through most of your life not even knowing what conservatives believe or tend to believe, right? Like you're not hearing it in your media, you're not hearing it in your schools. You've been told that what they think is is, fascist or hateful or whatever. So they don't even know. If we had a less of a monoculture, more of a robust debate in our media and in our universities, then we could hash out those ideas, and probably people wouldn't be so polarized and extreme because they get to hear them and they could take the best from both sides. But so I think that is a free speech problem. If we don't have free speech, we don't have those kinds of discussions. We live in those little polarized echo chambers, and I don't think a society can function that way for very long. I mean, I don't know where it goes, but you can almost anticipate physical splintering. Like people just can't live with each other anymore because they're just so incompatible. They're just so extreme now that I don't know where that's going to end up. Are you seeing that too in the UK?
We are in terms of cancellations and so on and so forth. I've known friends who have gone through it absolutely, and certainly in terms of what we call the mainstream media over here, there is normally one side in many respects to that, and there's certain people who are watching give their opinion, and I'm thinking, regardless of what it is, you're always going to give the side your side, regardless of what it is. And so you end up with a lot of hypocrisy as a result of that.
Mhm.
But actually, it leads me on to another point, which is one of the things that counters that in the UK, especially over the last, say, 5, 6 years, is we have quite a lot of podcasts that
Mhm.
actually counter this. And I mean, podcasts that some of them have like over 1 million subscribers, get over 100,000 views on most of their videos, and that area is growing. And I'm just wondering that can do a counter narrative to that and actually invite other people on and challenge them and do like long form, like this podcast, for instance.
Mhm.
Doesn't Canada have anything like that where you have that little bit of culture where you have a podcast culture which could counter some of what these free speech claims and allow free speech to happen?
Yeah, we definitely do, but is the other side listening to them, I guess is the question. I mean, do we listen to the things that reinforce our existing worldviews, or do we let ourselves be challenged by counter opinions? And so I do think that is a fantastic new medium. As we know, the Joe Rogan podcast, for example, probably helped President Trump win that election because he reaches so many people, and you do get to hear what people think long form, unedited, and without the lens that a media company wants to put on it. I mean, I've done media interviews myself for various cases, especially during COVID, and what I found typically was the mainstream media, if I did an online interview um, like this, they would just take snippets that took it out of context and use that in their report. And so the mainstream media will present the narrative that they want to present and get the experts and so on that they want. And they'll tell a story based on the particular narrative that they want to present. So they'll take a little snippet of, say, President Trump's speech and take it out of context. So the podcasts are a huge blessing because they allow people to actually hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak, exactly what it is without somebody messing with it. But the problem is that the other side isn't listening to it, I think. You probably have an audience that, well, I don't know where your guests come from typically. But I would say if your podcast tends to attract a certain demographic, you're probably not going to reach the other ones, right? Because people will listen to what they find appealing.
I think the issue with a lot of podcasts, I haven't found it as yet, maybe if I do want to grow, but I hear a lot of podcasts say, well, we want to get so and so guest on. And I have like a reasonable, want to have a reasonable conversation with them, but a lot of them won't actually come on.
Mhm.
That's one of the main issues is there's certain guests who won't come on, even if it's going to be a cordial, because I want it to be on a particular platform, parroting particular views. Um, and so I think that can be an issue, although hopefully that will change in the near future as well. You talked about the left there, and obviously what you said, your opinion about the left, this has come from them in terms of free speech. What do you think about what the right's done to counter that?
Yeah, well, I have my misgivings about where the right may go with all of this too. They can be reactionaries in their own way, and what I don't want to see happen is more of the same, but from a right perspective. My concern is that there aren't truly that many people who seem to, um, I don't know, value free speech regardless of where it comes from. It's a hard thing to do, especially in this polarized time. I can kind of understand that if you've got the power now, you want to make sure that the other guys can't do what you don't want them to do. But it seems like there's this horseshoe, right, where sort of the freedom sits at the top, and there aren't that many people up there. The liberties perspective, and then the rather than being kind of like a left-right line, it kind of loops around to like a horseshoe, and they're almost the same on the bottom of that horseshoe, right? So I will certainly be watching to make sure that the right doesn't do the same kind of thing as they become more powerful, and would certainly encourage people to to respect the principles underlying our free speech push, rather than just wanting to use the tools of cancellation on the other side.
Has it surprised you how much free speech has eroded, not just in Canada, but in the Western world over the last decade?
Yeah, very much. I mean, you've sort of been watching it progress. It's partly that I think the governments are doing things that their people don't fundamentally like and didn't vote for and don't want. And so I think a lot of it is the government's, I don't know what, I'm not trying to sound conspiratorial either, but it does sort of seem like all of our countries have similar things happening, which is almost happening against the populations in those countries. And so the attacks on free speech, I think, are in part designed to keep people from being able to criticize these policies. And well, I mean, JD Vance summed it up nicely in his speech to Europe at the Munich Security Conference the other day. Your people, the governments have become afraid of their people, and well, why are they afraid of their people? Because they aren't serving their people's interests. They're doing something else. I don't know. They've got some other agendas that they're trying to push through, and so they really don't want people to feel comfortable criticizing that, because or electing governments that are more populist. But see, that's the concern. And I don't think enough leaders, and I don't just mean government leaders, but leaders of institutions and universities and so on, don't appreciate that free speech is a pressure valve release, right? Like people need to be able to communicate how they feel. And if they can't communicate, if they can't vent, if they can't let off some steam and you know, express their objectionable opinions, well, guess what? They could very well turn to violence. And so it is that pressure release that the governments are forgetting is a very important valve for, you have to have that, or they're going to be facing pitchforks at some point if people can't express themselves in legitimate ways, right?
Yeah.
So
Your answers just made me think of another quick question. In terms of the written word, have there been any restrictions in regards to free speech in that sense? Not just in terms of media, but in terms of like fiction or books?
now, those kinds of things happen, I think, more from the bottom up. So you do find writers who write a book, or particularly if it's on a controversial topic, or they've written a book that they've said something completely unrelated, but they need to be canceled because they're not expressing the right views on whatever topic. So then you find like little writers groups, they refuse to give an award to somebody, or they seek to have them kind of kicked out of their groups and that kind of thing. So that's happening, has happened. I don't know if it's the tide may be starting to turn a bit on cancel culture. I think I'd like to be hopeful that worst of that has passed us. But yeah, I don't recall offhand any government curtailment of any books. Are you seeing that here?
There's been certain cases where authors have been cancelled because of what they've said in certain books. Absolutely. I think the main thing for me, because I come from a poetry background, I used to do spoken word many years ago, and I was finding that towards the end, because I left it many years ago, there were certain subjects that have been spoken about, and it was not just the subject, but they'll say that do a poem about the subject in a particular way, and it just ended up being boring. I don't know about cancellations, but it just ended up being boring. That's one of the things with free speech. The variety of speech gets lost, and the world just comes mundane if you don't have that variety. And obviously, people's thoughts get restricted because of that, because obviously speech is a important part of thought as well. So there have been slight issues there, but luckily you have like say podcasts and you have things like Substack as well, and you can self-publish that kind of circumvent all that. So I
Mhm.
do think there's ways around it in that regard. Um, where would you like to see free speech in Canada in like 5 years' time? Or realistically, where do you think it'll be?
Yeah, I mean, where I'd like it to be is back to sort of that stage where we could hear a variety of different perspectives, and come to our opinions after hearing them all. I mean, you know, I used to think I was sort of wishy-washy because like for the first, well, I'm in my late 50s now. So the first 50 years or so of my life, I felt like I really didn't have a strong opinion. And I desperately wanted to hear all sides. And I think I could argue all sides of just about any topic because I could see the different perspectives. And I just really feel like since the since our speech has become curtailed, our thought also has, right? We can't understand and navigate and interrogate the ideas of others and then help to inform our own views on things because we're only getting one side. And I just think yeah, we lose as a society when we can't hear all the ideas. They're not all going to be good ideas, but we need to hear them all, and so that we can kind of take that on board. I'd like to get back to that. I'd like to be able to hear all the different perspectives without somebody intermediating and saying, "Well, you can't hear that one," so that's the goal. I obviously don't want to see anybody getting penalized or canceled or sent to prison for their views. Um, whether that will happen in 5 years, I don't know. You know, it's funny. Like in the U.S., it seems kind of hopeful on the free speech front. That government has made it now their centerpiece of their policies to have free speech, and they already have the most robust constitution of all of the Anglosphere. What they did was they exported a lot of this culture war from the U.S. to all of the other countries, but not those tools to deal with it, not the ability to respond. So we're kind of stuck with the Americans' culture war, but not their robust constitution. So it's a lot harder for the other countries, I think, to navigate that. And the other problem we have in Canada is that we tend to be kind of our national identity is largely the fact that we're not Americans. And so when the Americans go big on something, we tend to go the other direction. And so I'm a little worried. I think things are going to get better in the US, but we might double down on it on some of the craziness in Canada just because that's what we do. I hope not. I'm gonna work really hard to make sure we don't, but
Hopefully, and I wish you all the best with that. If
thanks.
people want to find out more information about the Free Speech Union of Canada, where can they go to?
Our website is fsucanada.ca. You can join and become a member. It's a member-based organization, just like the UK one. And members will have access to a variety of different resources and events, but also just be able to say they're contributing to fighting for free speech in Canada. And then we'll take on some worthy cases with the resources that people bring in and help us, have the ability to take on. And we'll initiate some campaigns against government policies. And yeah, we got lots of plans. So I hope lots of Canadians will join us. And if you're listening in the UK, join FSU UK because they're doing some great work too.
Lisa, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's a subject that's really close to my heart. Thank you so much for coming into 286 Project.
Well, my pleasure. And it was so nice to meet you, Chris.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.